your role and what technologies did you use?
Yeah, excited to talk about that. That was a project worked on for a large retailer where we created a recommendation engine based on gathering data on people who did not register for the website. So, in other words, you go to a website, you start looking around, and based on your behavior, we can discern whether you're a male or a female, demographics, income, any number of things, based on huge amount of training data that we have from past customers who are, basically doing the same pattern. So the idea is, and lots of retailers use this, is we're able to take this engine and recommend things to the customer that they may not have known that they needed. So in other words, we see somebody is interested in men's clothing. We know that there's a probability that they also may be interested in camping or hunting sports, things like that. And your ability to kind of test it and see if that's something that they're looking to do, then based on that response, your ability to recommend other things. And so the engine that we created was able to increase sales by 30%. And this is all without customers having to register, opt into technology. This is just about them using the site and our ability to upsell them just kind of based on the behaviors. Other thing before that, I built a generative AI-driven supply chain integration system. During COVID, the supply chains were absolutely a mess. We couldn't get anything moving. People realized that they were under automated and under optimized. So I built a generative AI system that would, in essence, provide complete logistics planning and training based on where the thing was being built and manufactured versus where it needed to go, dealing with the supply chain, including the suppliers for the manufacturers building the product, and looking at very complex parameters that are very difficult to manage normally. And you consider tens of thousands of data points at the same time, and your ability to make decisions based on what those data points are as to the best optimized way to build something, to ship something, to make sure that the suppliers are producing the raw materials that are needed for manufacturing. Just the ability to kind of get to soup to nuts in terms of how you manage something from a customer saying, I need something, to the building, the selling, the shipping, the sales, order entry, all these sorts of things, and where it's a complete automated system where you're relatively assured, obviously things go wrong from time to time, but it's able to operate around those things where you're going to be as optimized as you can. And in that case, a manufacturer of tires was able to optimize their supply chain, and it generated another $30 million in revenue just in the quarter in which it was implemented. So those are the two that I've done others, but those are the ones I like to talk about.
David, really great examples. Plus, I really love that you came back and you talked about the impact of the business. That's great, and thank you. Good experiences there. Now, David, how would you approach data set preparation and preparation for training generative AI models?
Well, the core thing is that the more clean and understood that the data is, the better it's going to be used within a generative AI system. Generative AI systems rely on clean and hygienic data. In other words, it's able to provide the information that you need, which is paramount, but the ability to make sure it's in good order and we know what it is and how it's represented. So we're gathering, very diverse data sets. In many instances, it could be images and PDF files. It could be customer data, it could be inventory data, sales data, all these sorts of things. Your ability to gather the data in such a way where it's organized to be presented to the generative AI model, where it's able to learn and train from these data in a very clean way. And this, by the way, is where probably 90% of generative AI projects go off the rails, is they don't spend the time in investing in the existing data sets and understanding the data and getting the metadata correctly, getting the data hygiene in good working order. All these things are fairly easy to implement. They're not overly complex and overly onerous processes. But it's figuring out where everything's coming from, what it means, and your ability to present it properly to the models that are learning from the data so they can build the knowledge models around the data. So it's the normalization, augmentation, the ability to reduce dimensionality of the data, the ability to remove some of the complexity, all these sorts of things. The more that you can do that where it's in an understandable state, if you can understand it as a human being, then your generative AI system can understand it. So that's really kind of the metrics that I use. Obviously tools, data hygiene tools, metadata management, data integration systems, all these things kind of come into play. But the core value in this is your ability to get these things right, your ability to make sure the data is in a state where it can be consumed, where it is going to be the source of truth that the engine is built upon. People consider generative AI as some sort of a magic trick where it's able to deal with bad data, and it's able to find bad data, remove bad data. Some of that's in there, but not a lot. So the core thing, if you're, it's garbage in, garbage out with generative AI data. In fact, it's worse because if it's building a knowledge model based on erroneous data or unclean data, things like that, that knowledge model is going to have that issue built into it that's very difficult to remove. So start with clean data. Data hygiene's in the way. Understand where the data is, how it's consumed, and that's a foundation for generative AI success.
David, I love that. You said if the data is going to be the source of truth, it has to be clean. Expert answer there. Thank you. So walk me through how you would design and train a generative adversarial network for image generation. What metrics would you use to evaluate its performance?
Yeah, basically, at the end of the day, we're looking at core parameters that are able to teach it how to create images from random noise and discriminators that learn to distinguish between things that are real and things that are not real or fake. So the process basically loops through it. So the idea being we're going to get it wrong, going to get it wrong, going to get it wrong, going to get it wrong based on these images that we use. And until we get something that is moving to something that is the desired state. So it continues until the generator becomes proficient at producing, the images. And you only do that through practice and trial and error. So the great thing about generative adversarial networks is that it's almost like two robots looking across each other at a conference table. And so they're producing ideas, in this case, images. It can be text, it can be other things as well. And they're putting it up, and the other one is looking at it and verifying it, and in essence, making sure that it's right. And if it's not right, it will reject that image. And so that's where the adversarial comes from. So these robots kind of fight it out until the images are correct into a state that's the desired outcome. The idea of generative AI networks is they're always becoming better at taking the information, always learning how to do things better, and that's an example of it. So if you're designing a generative adversarial network, and by the way, you're normally not involved with that as an architect, you're picking tools and technology, and the engineers are doing this on your behalf. But understanding the concept is that we're picking a particular approach to dealing with this information, such as a GAM, and that the adversarial nature of that gets to a better, more desired outcome, again, based on the information coming in that's in a state enough where it's able to, generate the right systems. So it's kind of a fun little thing. If you're picking this technology, you don't see this happening, but in the background, you'll notice that initially when you come to these conclusions, or basically it creates these images, and image, it could be a song, could be, text generation, whatever. It's the same sort of processes that are involved. It takes a tremendous long time initially for it to train, learn, and generate the responses for the inference engines. But over time, it becomes more proficient. And that's where it gets almost like human-like characteristics. As we train something, we become smarter as people. And the smarter it becomes, the faster it's able to generate the information, the better it's able to generate the information. So the idea is we're using this architecture as kind of a check and balance. I like to talk to my clients and tell them it is about like two robots sitting across the table and they're having an argument, but they're really, really smart robots, and whatever they come up with is going to be an answer that's going to be better than the sum of the two decisions that they made, and then iterate that again and again and again before they produce images that are amazing. So that's the power of generative AI. And this, by the way, applies to images and text and music generation, video generation. All these sorts of things are available to us now. The generative and generative AI is we can generate information and output in any number of ways that we want to do it. So it's not limited just to images, but it's interesting to explore kind of what GAM is as it's related to images, and that's kind of something that's easier for people to visualize.
Yeah, and that's well explained, and most people don't really understand that adversarial network because they can't see it, but it's so critical to see both sides of things. So terrific. David, have you ever had to overcome a situation where your generative AI model suffered from mode collapse? And if so, how did you handle it?
Yeah, they all do at some point. So it's when the model repeats itself or fails to show a wide range of diversity in its outputs, and in other words, it's limited. It's getting things wrong. At the end of the day, we can get into why it's getting things wrong, but there's something wrong with the information that is consumed or how it's processing these things from an inference engine. But it has to be fixed. In other words, we're just not getting the outputs that we need. And so in mode collapse, erroneous data, you can call it a number of things. It's just a mechanism, a way to define an error that is an error state that it's getting to and the cause of it's getting to. So when you fix it, you promote diversity within the data sets. You may change the model structure. There's some tuning capabilities you can put in there. And your ability to go through and continuously improve the information in the inference model. So it's able to produce things better and in essence, reduce the impact of mode collapse, if not completely eliminated. So diversity of information ultimately is where you get to the better outcomes in this. In other words, our ability to look at a massive amount of data where it's going to have a visualization across the data, where it's able to discern patterns within the data. So if you can't do that, you can't provide the diversity of information and the diversity of outputs of the system, it's not going to get to a state that's going to be usable. The good news with this is that there's tools and technology out there that will fix this for you. So architects typically aren't dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. This is kind of an engineering concern. They should know what it is and how to address it. But as far as the mechanisms to fix it, those aren't necessarily in the domain of the architect, but it is in the domain of the architect to understand how these errors are going to occur and make sure that we're building and architecting a system that's not going to go this way. And if it does, our ability to have an automated fixing or self-healing mechanism to reduce the impact of the mode collapse and remove it directly from the system.
Thank you for that. Ethics. So David, in your experience, what are some ethical considerations when working with generative AI, particularly in the context of, say, deep fakes or content generation?
That's a great question. You have to remember that generative AI is a bit risky when it comes to ethical concerns just because of the power of the system. So we're able to do things that are very concerning, including generate videos, of people who have more than 10, 15 hours of video out there on the open internet, and it's very difficult to discern, if not impossible to discern. So we have a lot of ethical considerations because we know that we can do something. We just need to ask if we should do something. And that's really where ethics comes in. So this information, these knowledge models that we build is going to have bias information in it. They're all biased. To the degree of how it's biased is really kind of depend on the training that you use. But it comes down to looking at the harm and impact this is going to happen for human beings. So where there's biased information, deep fakes, your ability to generate erroneous photos, your ability to produce things that are going to be influence people more than they should. All these things really kind of come to bear. So it's working with people that understand what the best practices are in terms of ethics. And one of the things I always do on my team when I run an generative architecture program is I have an ethics specialist, someone who has a deep understanding in terms of what the best practices are out there and what we should do versus what we can do. We can do a lot of stuff. We can look at the information and biases. For example, when I talked about that recommendation engine that we built, there's lots of things that you can do with that data that will help the business and provide it a better inside track and understanding the customer. But there's also ethical concerns in doing that. And you have to kind of make sure that we're not crossing that line. And this is a line we're going to come up to many times. And so my advice is, number one, look at the reality of of how you're going to build these systems and impacts that it can have on human beings and society and nature, but also get somebody who understands how to deal with the ethical concerns on your team that you can chat with, and we can put an ethics plan together and bias elimination plan together, and we can do bias audits so we can people can understand if there's any bias in the system at a particular time. And you have to remember that it's not when you're going to go to, it's not if you're going to go to court over this, it's when you're going to go to court. And so that being the case, you always need to build these generative AI systems as if you're explaining it to a judge and a jury. And so we're always thinking about how to practice defensive ethics, doing the things we should put in there so we're not harming human beings, but also the ability to audit and track and log all the various things and decisions that we're making. So if we do have to explain it to a court or a judge or a lawyer or binding arbitration or even the board of directors, things like that, we're going to be able to do that. So it's much different than traditional systems where you don't necessarily have the power to do a lot of things that are going to cause ethical concerns. In generative AI systems, you do. And I think that an ethics program is going to be bound to all these projects. In fact, I wouldn't work on a generative AI project without some sort of ethics counseling and auditing that occurs within the system. It just removes the risk.
A really great response. I also really like the way you said it. Just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should do something. That's something we all need to think about.
Yep.
So, David, you've been in this world for a little while. What are your thoughts on the current state of generative AI research, and where do you see it heading in the next few years?
Yeah, obviously, it's the focus of most people are in the technology world right now. Doesn't matter if you're building operational systems or security systems or platforms. Everybody's looking at how they're going to work and play well with this model. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in my career, and I've been doing this stuff for 30 plus years. So the focus right now in terms of the state of the generative AI system is probably too focused on the tactical tools and technologies, focused on the processors, GPUs, TPUs, focused on some of the engines that are being built, and focused on, basically who's turning out what, whether a cloud provider is better at generative AI than the other cloud provider, which is fine, but it's not something we can do longer term. So longer term, we need to focus on how this technology is going to evolve in a couple of years, and where is it going to be, and where does the business need to be in terms of consuming that technology. So it's less thinking about the cool tools and the processors and the use cases for generative AI that are out of this world in terms of fun stuff to think about, but the ability to look at how we're going to find the business applications. So we're getting things planned, we're getting things processed to make sure that we're going to build something and that's going to be of value to the business in 1 year, 2 years down the line. So it's not focused on the shiny objects. It's focused on the real world benefits of this stuff. And I think utilization and the use cases of generative AI for most businesses is going to be very tactically oriented. They're going to build smaller language models and rather than large language models. It's going to be dealing with strategic uses of the technology to differentiate the business and really kind of create the innovative differentiators within the marketplace. For example, the two that I mentioned, the recommendation engine, the supply chain integration system, intelligent supply chain management, would be instances of that. But the ability to automate manufacturing, the ability to have a common knowledge mechanism across robotics within a factory, the ability to put intelligence at the edge so we're able to manage oil platforms in ways that are going to be safer and more productive. And so all these things should be put on the radar screen right now in terms of how we're going to use the technology and the tactical uses of the technology. I think we have a tendency to be too focused on the large language models that are out there and what they're able to do. And those are going to be important. And we're going to use utilities out of those. And, if they're accessible via APIs, are going to be part of the process. But the bigger question, which people aren't answering now, is what this technology means to our particular business and what we're going to use it on. So you go to meetings where they have a generative AI steering committee for a large company. They're just reviewing the cool stuff. They're talking about the releases of the next coolest LLM. They're talking about the different cloud providers and how they're approaching generative AI, and not necessarily the core technologies that they're looking to build. So the focus should be, and my focus is on where that technology is going to be in 2 or 3 years and what is going to be the relative value and meaning to the business. The thing is, if we're going to be generative AI architects or any kind of architect, we have to have that in sight. So it's probably too much focus on the things that really aren't going to matter in a few years, and not enough focus on the tactical uses of the technology for the particular business domain. And I think that's a harder and not as fun problem to address. And I think, but that's where I focus, and that's where I think businesses should focus on where this stuff is going. So how we're going to use it, how we're going to employ it, and kind of watch that the shiny objects are not necessarily the distraction that they are right now.
And David, excellent. It's where the tech is going and what that tech can do for the business. I'm in complete agree with you, not the speed, the feed, or whatever the coolest in vogue tech is. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Now, David, could you discuss a time when you optimized a generative AI model for better efficiency or performance? What steps did you take?
Yeah, the best one would be the recommendation engine that I built, because if they don't operate at speed, then they're not useful, because people are going to hang around for a website if it keeps going away for 5-10 seconds at a time. So in tuning these models for performance and optimizing these models to provide better knowledge management, better predictive management, better inference responses, things like that, it's going to the tools that are able to carry out a few core operations, such as residual connections, your ability to make sure those are normalized, the ability to look at progressive growing and normalization techniques of the data. So in other words, if I'm building this knowledge model, making sure that I'm building it for a good reason. In other words, we're adding true knowledge. We're not adding redundant information. We're not overtraining the model. We're not training it on things that it doesn't need to understand. And you remember, most of these things, as we talked about, are going to be purpose built. They're there for a particular business case. They don't need to be something that's going to learn from everything that exists on the internet. They just need to learn about their particular domain and the decisions that they need to make. So it's looking at what the model is currently doing and kind of asking the question, does it really need to do this? And if it doesn't, then that functionality, that knowledge should be removed from the system. It shouldn't worry about processing that stuff. Looking at how it's going to grow and how it's going to perform in terms of model performance over time, but also how it's going to become better and more approved at the time. So when you optimize a generative AI model, you're going to be constantly improving in terms of how it's going to come up with answers and how it's going to manage information. So it's always asking the question. Good news is, where these things used to be done by hand, someone would have to write an application or a script to do this stuff. Now there's tooling that's able to do this on your behalf. So optimization of the generative AI model, depending on what model instance you're running, the tool that you're using, the brand, the type, version, all those sorts of things, are going to have the optimization tools that are connected to it. So a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily in the domain of the architect, and a lot of this stuff probably isn't in the domain of the engineer. We just need to understand that these things have to occur and ensuring that we have the right tools that are carrying these things out. So, and also this is something that's going to change a great deal in the next couple of years. You have to keep that in mind. So the way in which we optimize these models now, which just got into it with the advent of generative AI and learning as we're going with those, is going to be very different in 2 years. So um, my recommendation, as well as doing residual connection, progressive growing, normalization, all this stuff, which is fundamental to doing this, is that we're able to pick the right tools, technology, and approaches are going to assist us in making this happen. That doesn't mean we're focused just on the tools. That means we're focused on what needs to be done and the domain of tools out there that can help us get this done, and our ability to bind it to those tools, putting the complexity of the optimization of the generative AI model in the domain of the tool versus it being something that a human being has to go after every few weeks. That never scales because you can't get consistency there, repeatability there. It's something that's not going to be optimized unto itself. So if you're optimizing a generative AI model, it's about understanding what you need to do to make that model better from a design perspective, from an architecture perspective. And beyond that, it's leveraging the right technology. So this optimization is done in an automagical way behind the scenes. So it's really just kind of part of the infrastructure.
Sounds great, David. David, how comfortable are you deploying AI models in production? Could you talk about any experience you have with, say, MLOps practices?
Yeah, the great thing about deploying AI models, specifically generative AI models, into production systems is they follow the same sort of processes and many instances the same tooling as traditional DevSecOps, DevOps. So continuous integration, continuous deployment, your ability to version the models out there, your ability to lock the configuration in terms of the hardware, software, cloud configuration that you're leveraging. All those toolings basically have followed the generative AI system, and so they're able to provide the same automation. So it's good news, bad news. The good news is we don't have to hire lots of new people who are going to do the CI/CD, integration and model monitoring and tuning and versioning out there. And it's going to be very similar, if not the same tooling. But you need to bind it into the DevOps tool chain. You need to bind it to the particular applications that use these models. You need to version these models in much the same way. And they're going to require a little bit different understanding in how we do versioning. It's not just an instance of a database. It's not just an instance of a code tree. It's going to be a complete knowledge model, which is this huge monster in many instances unto itself that we have to lock in a particular configuration. So we have to have the toolings that are able to make that happen. By the way, this does not mean that you're taking a copy of that knowledge model, putting it off someplace, because it could take a huge amount of storage to maintain these things. But we are taking a copy of the configuration, the tuning parameters, the model numbers, some of the knowledge data in the system, even the training data. So we understand how to return to that state. Certainly, as people start out with generative AI systems, they're going to get to a point where they realize, oh, darn, we made a mistake. They probably won't say, oh, darn. And they're going to have to go back to a previously stable version of it. And so that's the ability to hit the reset button, go back to different state of training data, different set of the model instance. And if you've done this versioning and you've done this tracking along the way, that's going to be fairly easy to do. And you're going to protect yourself. You're going to lower the risk of doing the development. I'm finding that people have a tendency not to pay attention to that. So they haven't put these into model versioning techniques, configuration management, all these sorts of things. And they get to a point where they go, oh, darn, we made a mistake. And we built this model using erroneous data that was dirty, for instance. And we're trying to get back to a previous state so we don't have to retrain the entire model and deal with the overhead in doing that. And they can't do that.
So, David, what types of generative models have you worked with, and in what context have you deployed them?
Well, in the recommendation engine, I worked with an image generation model that was also a content generation model. So it was generating text as well as images, in some cases, videos, instructional videos for people who were leveraging the website. So the retailers, the generative AI model in that instance would generate a custom image, very cool, for a particular person based on who they were. So it wasn't just presenting images of camping equipment, as we mentioned before. We realized they're shopping for men's clothing, so therefore there's 70% chance they may want to look at camping stuff as well. But your ability to generate an image that was specifically targeted at how that person perceives camping, even the area of the country where they are. So if they live in Arizona, it would generate a desert image. If they live in the Northeast, it would generate a forest image. All those sorts of things where it provides that extra bit of motivation to get them to look particular at the equipment. Also, text of the system. Instead of generating static content, the ability for the generative AI system to generate unique text for the particular individual. So once we know who they are, we know what level they read at, we know what they respond to, we know keywords that are in there, even putting it in a different language if needed. Once we figure out that they're a German speaker, for example, and they think it's very cool, but you figure out I'm a German speaker and you start showing the thing in German. So it worked on those, your ability to generate images and text, the ability to in the supply chain scenario, your ability to generate logic around and logistics around a certain supply chain. So we're not generating text, but we're generating pass through a map, for example, and processes in place, and the ability to kind of stepwise through this stuff in terms of how you build and deploy a particular piece of equipment that you're selling, and the raw materials good producers and what they should be doing, all those sorts of things. Obviously, we're generating text to generate the POs and the invoice and the way in which we control the information. But the larger issue is that we're generating a map, we're generating the content. So we're generating, in essence, entities, which may be represented as images and text. But the larger thing is we're generating the plan and how these things are going to work. Ability to spot fraudulent systems in building banks. And obviously that was where we're inputting data, and your ability to look at checks to spot for patterns that may lead to fraud in building those systems. Looking at real-time images, and, the ability to identify them, such as security systems. They're able to look at images as people who are approaching the building, identify who they are and where they come from. In fact, they just had a issue in China where they're able to find a serial killer based on this technology. And ultimately, any sort of thing that's able to get to the state. And remember, the important thing here is that we're building the model, the ability to generate different outputs of the model that are facilitate whatever kind of a business outcome you're looking for is a fairly easy step in the process. So, but your ability to build knowledge model in such a way where it's going to have this kind of flexibility, the ability to generate this stuff in any way you want to consume it, is going to be where the work needs to occur. So generative AI models to deploy all kinds of different outputs based on the needs of the particular business, but the core models ultimately using the same steps, the same processes to build the same stuff.
Thank you for that. So, David, quality matters.
And
how would you assess the quality of
relate
generated
to,
samples from a
and so
generative
on
model?
and so on. You can see.
Well, you can always look at the
there.
things like images
You
and
can
text
do that
to
same
see if it's something that's
exercise
acceptable.
above the line.
One of the
Thank
things
you
that
for
people
the
have used
heart. Below the line, you can do
ChatGPT
that same
before,
exercise
when they ask it to
for
write something that's fairly
your
simple,
area
you'll notice
of
that
skill.
in many cases it's a mile wide
When
and an
you
inch deep, so it just
have
generates lots of content.
identified
So your ability to
the
have a
skill
logical
that you
assessment
want
of
to
something as to whether or not it's going to have
develop,
value or not is something you need
you
to
can
do. So
then
it's visual
start to work on
inspection,
it. So take a
quantitative
minute
metrics, domain-specific
with the
evaluation criteria
take
that these
notes
businesses put in there in
icon
terms of what.
and jot down what are some of the subsets, the sub-skills, micro skills that you could work on that would elevate to,